Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Malcolm Brown. I'm President of the Geological Society. And welcome to this, the 5th Society London Lecture of 2018, which has been designated Year of Resources. Today's lecture is entitled, Could We Ever Have Known How Dinosaurs Thought or Behaved? It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Norman of Cambridge University. The last non-avian dinosaur trod the Earth about 66 million years ago. So researching such ephemeral topics as thought and behaviour in such long-dead creatures presents us with many scientific imponderables. It is arguably one of the ultimate forensic challenges. David is a palaeobiologist based at the Department of Earth Sciences in Cambridge. He trained at Leeds University and then King's College London and the Natural History Museum, where he worked on Iguanodon. He worked in Brussels on the extraordinary herd of Iguanodon discovered at Deinonychus, and later returned to London at Queen Mary's College and then Oxford University before working for the government. He then became the first director of the Sedgwick Museum, a post he has held for some 20 years. David has been involved in paleobiological research on all continents except Antarctica, has trained some of the leading vertebrate paleontologists of the present day, and has written several books on dinosaurs and their biology, including recently Dinosaurs, A Very Short Introduction with Oxford University Press. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Norman.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Good evening, and here we go. We're talking about dinosaurs and trying to really investigate, almost from a forensic perspective, how we might induce or deduce aspects of their biology, behaviour, and so on. And to do so, you need to draw in various aspects of the things that we know that are associated with dinosaurs. That can be hard parts, it can be things left behind by dinosaurs. And the task we're faced with is that, given that despite Jurassic Park and what you might read in the media, these are extremely rare things, actually drawing the information together and telling a coherent and, in a sense, believable story is the problem that we all face. When in any historical science, it's that sort of problem. It's trying to draw together something where you don't have a time machine to go back and test in a verifiable scientific sense, in a Popperian sort of world, exactly what your deductions have been or what you've induced in terms of the data that you've seen. So it's an impossible task. So my skills, if they are any, are ones where I'm trying to be persuasive. It's the skills of a barrister. I'm trying to persuade the 12 honest and true citizens that my interpretation of the circumstances is the most plausible. And therefore, you find the opponent guilty. But that aside, I want to try and draw you through a process of how we make reasoned deductions or inductions about the information that we've got, and how draw together, I hope, a series of strands that sort of, in a sense, tell a story and build a picture of what dinosaurs were like in a reasonable way, and embellish it a little bit by thinking about this issue which I've sort of tempted you with, which is, how do we know how they thought? The contents are tangential to that, but nevertheless, maybe we can develop some sort of insight into the subject. Before I actually start the lecture, I'd just like to say, in a way, this is a sort of thank you and memorial to somebody who you may know, or some of you may know, Martin Brasier, professor at Oxford, tragically killed in a car accident just before a meeting a few years ago. Martin and I had, since we were both at Oxford, we crossed swords over a particular specimen and argued furiously for about 3 years, basically to no avail. But I got the result out in the end. So sorry, Martin. We'll hear about that a bit later. So let's get on with the lecture. So the strands that I'm going to try and, in a way, they're not as clear-cut as they seem in those 4 points there. But I'm going to try and sort of structure the lecture a little bit, despite the overlaps, to show you how the information tends to get put together. So we'll deal with footprints, elements of anatomy and biomechanics, although they sort of overlap, bone histology, and soft tissues. So we're sort of getting closer and closer to the soft part of the biology of these creatures, and the geological circumstances that might have led to some rather interesting preservation. So let's get started and deal with number one, footprints and trackways. The photograph on the left, top left, is a specimen from Yorkshire. It's a Jurassic footprint, and you can see those three nice, long, lozenge-shaped toe impressions of what? Well, it's Mesozoic, and if you look at the technical drawing here, you can see these rather long, lozenge-shaped toes. And it seems quite probable that what you've got here is the impression of a footprint left behind by a creature like this, which was a quite large predatory dinosaur. The foot corresponds to the print, and in truth, if you were to touch that specimen, you're as near as you're ever going to get to a dinosaur. A dinosaur sort of went past that, left that behind. You're terribly close to the actual critter that left that. It's one of those rare, quite common things, but it's in a way, when you think about it, it's quite moving, risking a joke, that you might be that close to the critter that actually left that. That, as an individual specimen, is interesting per se. It's pretty, it tells you something about the animal and perhaps the nature of that animal. I know, because of the shape of the toes, that that was a carnivorous beast. Its feet are rather distinctive. So I can begin to induce from the data some sort of scenario as to what this critter was. So that's something, moving in a direction of a live animal. On other occasions, if you're lucky, sometimes you can find arrays like this. This is a footprint trackway. Lots and lots of, as you can see, superimposed footprints, which were not the same shape as the footprints that you see over there. They're not elongate toe impressions. You have rather large, rounded, plate-like feet, which poses a question. Again, they're Mesozoic, they're big. You know, some of these footprints are about yay big, so these are really quite large feet. But what left them? And that's where having some understanding or knowledge of the overall anatomy of various creatures, and they are varied, so you need a sort of encyclopedic knowledge of the different varieties of anatomy to help the interpretation. Ends up with the most reasonable interpretation of the shape of those footprints, which are basically more or less plate-like, circular, and then some others that are D-shaped, that are often associated with the big plate-like ones. And the animals that have the right configuration of toes are these. These are so-called brachiosaurs. They're obviously rather large elephantine creatures. They can be up to 25 meters in length, may have weighed somewhere between 15 and 20 tons. It's a big animal. Big feet, big impressions, and you can see the similarity of general footprints, or it's a bit characterized, but you can see that the feet are rather distinctive and similar to the footprints that you saw earlier. So we know roughly what type of animal left the footprints, but there's another message. There's a whole bunch of them moving in that general direction in the same group. We have what appear to be a set of overlapping footprints. You know, one footprint is left behind, then another steps on top of it. So you seem to have a cluster of these animals moving together in the same direction at the same time, which is a rarity. You don't often have an opportunity to get that close to the timing of footprints being left. And in this instance, there's also another story that emerges, which is that there are big footprints out here and smaller ones here. You could argue quite plausibly that you've got a structured herd, or dare I say flock, of dinosaurs moving in the same general direction. And perhaps you might be able to reasonably conclude that there actually is a structure to the herd. Big ones on the outside, smaller, more vulnerable specimens in the middle. So that's interesting in terms of a behavioural repertoire that these dumb, stupid animals may have had, which is sort of runs counter to that old, ancient sort of Victorian view of what dinosaurs were. Old, slow, stupid things destined for extinction. And I'll keep repeating that sort of contradiction, you know, the old perspective versus perhaps a reasonable forensic understanding of what these things imply about the biology and way of life of these animals. So already something as big and stupid as these huge dinosaurs may have had a rather structured life, some sort of implication of social interactions and knowing how to move, especially if there's some big meat-eating predators around when you want to protect your young. Isn't that something similar to animals that live today? Yeah, in a general sense. There are other messages that come through which relate to the shape of the foot. Big, round, plate-like feet. There are other animals that have big, round, plate-like feet, and they're big and heavy as well. Elephants. There's the sole of an elephant. They don't have individual toes sticking out. They have rounded footprints and would leave footprints rather like the ones that we saw. Why? Because they're energetically efficient. If you weigh 15 tons and you step, every time you take a step, although we don't tend to appreciate it, you lift your center of mass. One of the neat things about dinosaurs is that they actually walk on their tips of their toes. They all do that. If you walk on the tips of your toes, as all the women might be familiar with if you wear moderately high heels, then you raise your center of mass and you sort of glide along the surface. Your head doesn't bob up and down. Olympic runners know the same. Usain Bolt, when he's running at speed, he's up on the tips of his toes. Watch his head. It's absolutely flat. He's not wasting energy moving his center of mass up and down. Elephants do the same. If you weigh 4 or 5 tons, the last thing you want to do is waste energy lifting your body and then dropping it again. So up on your toes and, neat, have an elasticated ball of tissue behind the foot which stores elastic strain energy when the weight is on the foot, as you can see it compressing, and then releases it as the weight is taken off for the next. So you get a spring heel effect. Dinosaurs did the same. Elementary biomechanics in relation to a large, heavy, in this case, herbivorous animal. It makes perfect logical sense, and why shouldn't they? They have the efficiency of locomotion that's seen in modern animals like elephants. Perfectly reasonable. Some of you may have attended Emily Rayfield's lecture. She's one of my former PhD students, where she was looking at the biomechanics of dinosaur skulls. It's the taking the engineering principles, hey, that's not geology, and applying them in an interdisciplinary way to a problem and trying to solve it that way by using a range of different scientific disciplines. This is forensic science at its most basic, bringing in different scientific disciplines to try and solve a problem, provided you realize there's a problem. So back to the structured herd. Maybe this scenario in this lovely picture by John Gertsch isn't completely fake. You have these very large critters on the outside, little youngsters, actually rather large animals, but nevertheless little youngsters compared to the adults, being protected by the outriders against lurking predators. It's not so unreasonable in relation to those footprints that we saw just a little while ago. And we've built a reasonable scenario about a biology and a way of life, and that has implications about the mental thought processes that the dinosaurs were going through to actually do that, to have, in a sense, the wisdom to realize if you move in a structured herd, your young are safer. Not unreasonable. A third more relatively recent discovery was a friend of mine, Martin Lockley, who's based in Denver, Colorado, has done a lot of work on fossil footprints. And more recently, he's discovered that there appear to be these cleared areas, and it's not just a one-off. A number of different sites have been found in Colorado, which appear to be cleared areas within which you find these very characteristic double scrapes, these pits, sort of double pits with piles of sediment on either side. And you could say the fanciful, but the interpretation that was eventually put on this is not a weird geological sedimentary phenomenon. We actually see scrape marks on the sides of these pits where these animals had actually dug these pits out. And what he proposed was that this was actually a lek. It's rather like grouse and capercaillie and things like that. They create an arena, the males, and perform within the arena to attract females. Maybe what you have here is tyrannosaur-like animals creating these scrapes and these leks or arenas within which they behaved. Again, is that sluggish, stupid, destined for extinction type of behaviour in these sorts of dinosaurs? It sort of implies things about, in a sense, the awareness, behaviour, reaction to the environment, and again, maybe to some extent, females are dominating. They're actually the sexual selection going on here. The most elaborate displays, the most flamboyant males are being selected in a reproductive sense by the females. Bit of power for the females there. So tracks and other artifacts like tracks can actually imply quite a lot about the behaviour and way of life of these animals that perhaps create a more richly textured view. It's not the dinosaurs, it's what they've left behind. What they have left behind occasionally is quite reasonable skeletons. Sometimes they're patchworks that have to be put together. This is a thing called Deinonychus. A great friend of mine called John Ostrom, who's sadly passed away, described this. He was based in Yale, found this in Montana, pretty much complete. And the question then is, what style of animal is this? And your common sense, when you simply look at the body proportions, the proportions of the limbs, the rather wonderful balance of the animal, it's running on its back legs only. Its front legs were grasping. It couldn't use all fours. It had to have the neural integration and what was called technically proprioceptive feedback from the muscles to the brain to say, hey, we need to be able to balance here. So we need fast feedback between the body and the brain to result in the reaction to the muscles to maintain the balance. Think of a toddler and the amount of time it takes him to learn how to, or her, to learn how to walk on two legs. These guys were doing it. It implies a degree of neural sophistication within the brain to allow that posture, let alone the implication that this actually thing could scamper around pretty fast. It's also got eyes that point forward, all the better to see you with. It's really a rather sophisticated animal. Dull, stupid, destined for extinction. Possibly not. It's an extreme example, I know. It's an animal that's on the line leading to birds. So again, that bird connection also implies a degree of sophistication that some dinosaurs had. If we take it a little bit, we start to probe. This isn't the same animal, obviously, but the same things apply to the thing that we just looked at, as this animal here. This animal is appropriately named Aerostean. Its bones are full of air. Basically, this is as much of the skeleton as known. Every bone, so this bone has been sectioned, this large hip bone has been sectioned across here. If you look at the interior, it's full of holes, air-filled cavities. Even the clavicle, the collarbones here, have cavities in them. There are pneumatic openings. These vertebrae are just amazing structures, absolutely riddled with holes. Many of these dinosaurs are incredibly light. They look gigantic, but it's rather like an ostrich. You say, oh, big bird, that's going to be really heavy. You can sort of pick it up with one hand. They're incredibly light. These animals were big, but light. Most of them. And the reason to say most of them is that they're not all the same. Dinosaurs are many and varied. So when we're looking, and this is the complexity, when we're looking at overall general scenarios of explanation, we have to also be able to be aware of the diversity. This is an ornithischian. It doesn't have air-filled bones. So, okay, so it's a dinosaur. It's different. The parameters that affect its biomechanics and its operation as a critter, in general terms, are going to be different from those that applied to the two animals we've just seen. So some have weight-saving adaptations, some don't. Some move fast, some don't. This is a bit of a plodder. It's a rather slow-moving creature judged by its overall anatomy, and it's a lot heavier than the light, air-filled things that we just saw. So we have to be careful, because it's such an easy thing to just take one group as, but they're all like that, when in fact they're not. So the breadth of understanding is something can cause compromises in terms of getting a general understanding. So anatomy and biomechanics and how they work sort of underpin an understanding of how the animal works, and that has implications for its neural circuitry, the things that control its body movement. Some, if you think about bipedal forms, need a rather sophisticated, fast brain with very fast interactions between muscles and nerves that need to be coordinated by a thing up here to allow for bipedal running and balance. Others don't. So maybe there's a diversity of brain types. Another way of looking at them is, again, to take real anatomy, and this is, I'm sorry, it's not as clear as I'd like it to be. What you've got is a series of thin sections through bone of dinosaurs. And the point I'll just try and make briefly is that the cross-sections reveal the internal structure of bone. When dinosaur bones are found, they haven't gone through a process of mineral replacement. There's a sort of general perception that you pick up a dinosaur bone and basically it's been infilled by minerals and that's it. Our bones are made of calcium phosphate, the mineral apatite, fundamentally. It's an extremely durable mineral. So any dinosaur bone that you pick up is full of the original mineral. It's the original dinosaur bone. What's been added through permineralization is all the spaces have been filled up with extraneous minerals that are brought in the groundwater, which makes bones heavy. If they haven't gone through that process, and there's some lovely material that I've seen of a small baby Tyrannosaurus rex in Montana that was, fortunately, it died and got rolled into a mud ball, so there was no water percolating. And when you dig out the bones, they're light as a feather. They're just like the bones of recently dead animals. Depends on the circumstances, obviously. In this instance, when you take thin sections through the bone, you can see that there's a fabric with holes in it. Fundamentally, you've got blood vessels forming a mesh, which are bringing the minerals in, which are allowing the cells to grow, add bone to the surface of bone to build up the bone fabric and the strength of the bone. In dinosaurs, this one in the middle, you can get a slightly better impression. You can see there are what appear to be these white holes. That's the blood vessels, but they seem to be layered. You have, in effect, plywood. What you've got is these incredibly rapidly deposited layers of bone that create this plywood-like structure. Now, the only animals that can build that sort of bone are animals like young birds that grow incredibly quickly. So dinosaurs could also, and actually needed, to grow very quickly, and would have needed the physiology to allow that growth to take place very rapidly. So there are implications in just the structure of the bone and how it grew and how quickly it grew that reflect back on the metabolic rate of the animal. They also restructure their bone. And this is what happens after you've grown your bone in plywood form very quickly. In a sense, you have to sort of stop. Hey, now hang on, I'm going to walk around. That imposes stresses on the bone. And to compensate for the increasing stresses as growth increases, bone needs to be remodeled in an engineering sense. And what you've got here is what is called secondary or remodeled or Haversian bone, which is that stuff, but it's been burrowed out. You've got cells that have gone through the fabric of the bone, destroying it, and behind it are cells that build new little cylindrical structures that are elongate and organize along the lines of stress within the bone. So you can see that this is actively growing because these sort of thread-like structures are growing through the bone, but they keep adding them. So what you've got here is a lovely example of an osteone or Haversian system there that's actually etched away that one there. It's actually sort of burrowed through an osteone. So this is actively remodeling and remodeling as it goes. And your bones do just the same. You think of your bones as being solid and permanent. They're not. They're dynamically in equilibrium with your body all the time. If I were to undergo sort of an exercise regime and start stressing my shoulders, I would deposit extra bone to accommodate the extra stresses around my shoulder. It's your bones are doing the same all the time. There's a constant turnover of minerals. Again, we're getting closer to the biology of the animals indirectly by looking at structures that seem a bit abstruse, but actually relate to an understanding of the overall biology. A fourth line is soft tissues. This is where maybe things get even more interesting, possibly. We all know very well that in the 1990s, a variety of Chinese specimens, usually from Liaoning in northeast China, were discovered which had they had nice skeletons, frustrating skeletons. They're crushed flat, so it's really difficult to work on the bones. But around them is a halo of brown stuff. This is actually epidermal tissue and things growing out of the surface of the skin, either in the form of hair or filament-like structures or actual feathers. And when you get a microscope out, you can actually see some of these fabrics that are growing in the surface of the skin and out of the surface of the skin. The example here is a much more recent animal from Siberia. A friend called Pascal discovered this and described it. And it's very interesting because you can see here it's got a scaly tail, as all reptiles should have. Its body is covered with this sort of hair-like filaments, and its legs and arms have feathers. It's got this diversity of skin covering, which breaks up the models. As a modern biologist, you know that birds have feathers, and that's what defines a bird. No longer. There are a whole range of dinosaurs and this is nothing to do with birds. This is an ornithischian. It's nothing to do with bird origins. Oh, well, that's another story, because I've messed up the family tree of dinosaurs recently, but never mind. The point is that if you've got structures like that in animals, this could not fly. It just hasn't got wings. Forget birds. Why has it got this stuff? Well, if it's a conventional reptile, then it would need to bask in the sun to keep its body warm. The last thing you want, if you're a reptile, is an insulated covering. It reflect the heat rather than allowing you to absorb it to maintain your body temperature. These things must have been able to generate body heat internally and use the insulation to stop losing body heat out to the environment. That means they generated heat internally That tells you something about their metabolic rate and the greater similarity to mammals and birds of today. Perfectly reasonable, and we haven't done anything like rocket science. It's just a logical set of interpretations based on what we see and what we know of animals living today. No, nothing clever about that. It's just the logical inference. So the scenario of feathers is they weren't invented for flight. They were invented for insulation. Of course. But they have fossil records telling us that. So where did feathers come from? Well, there's a whole range of dinosaurs that have various forms of plumage, some ridiculous, like this great fan, geisha fan on the end of its tail, rather stupid, sort of inadequate wing feathers. Again, an overall interpretation would be that insulation was invented, dinosaurs would have mated, sexual selection would rear its ugly head in a sense. Males may perform to try and attract mates. So if you've got a geisha fan, you've got sort of colourful plumage, then maybe you can attract a female and reproduce and pass your attributes on to the next generation. If you could then augment that by jumping up in a branch and fluttering down, make your display even more fantastic, maybe that would give you a selective advantage. Maybe that's the origin of flight feathers way down the line from the original insulation that developed in these small, highly active animals. Now, okay, flight's a fantasy. Sorry, again, didn't mean that pun. But these slightly flight of fantasy sort of interpretations are built on a set of observations and reasonable inductions. I don't think I'm saying anything that's wildly controversial in terms of the biological import, but it has implications on how these animals worked, behaved, and what their physiology and metabolism was like. It's sort of an inevitable consequence of picking these bits, these little bits of observation, drawing them together into an integrated scenario. So, can we take this a little bit further? Yeah, of course we can. I'm going to try and fill up an hour. I'm going to use two examples. These are sort of technical drawings, slightly artistic, but technical drawings of dinosaurs that we know. Some of them have great big sort of broad snouts. They're called duck-billed dinosaurs for a reason. They have rather broad duck-like bills. Some of them have odd excrescences, prongs and things on the top of their heads. And this one's got a sort of pipe-like thing here, and this one's got a helmet-like crest. I'm going to use these two examples just briefly to investigate what that might mean and how it might be interpreted. So this is Parasaurolophus, which is that fellow over there with a pipe on its head. And colourful restoration, we don't know what the colours were like in general terms, but nevertheless, that's the overall impression of the critter with its duck-like beak. And this enormous pipe on the top of its head, which went from the nostrils backwards. And in the past, people have tried to say, well, what were these for? Quite reasonably. These are the various theories. It was a snorkel. So these dabbled in aquatic vegetation on the waterline, and while the head was underwater, they could breathe through the snorkel. Great, perfectly reasonable. Except that's closed off, so snorkel doesn't work. Another one, well, maybe it was a reservoir for air, like a scuba diver. If you sort of take in the air, store it in this container, and breathe it when you fancy it. The volumes just don't work. It's just ridiculous. And these are published in the scientific literature, so we can laugh now. But these were serious ideas at the time. Branch deflector, this is a rare one. My PhD my dissertation undergraduate supervisor at Leeds was musing over this, and he reckoned that if they hunched down and had this sort of long tube which they could connect to the back of the shoulder, then actually they could run through dense foliage and it could deflect all the branches over the back of the animal. Yeah, nobody has disputed that. I think it deserves to be disputed, but nobody has. Then we get more reasonable. Fabulous sense of smell. Well, the part of the brain associated with the sense of smell is right at the front of the brain case. And this tube-like structure is very close. So if that whole tube was full of sensory cells, then maybe it would give them a very acute sense of smell. You can't dispute or deny that. Perfectly reasonable. Visual recognition. It's very distinctive. It allowed us to separate it from the other critters that are found in the same rocks at the same age. So maybe it was literally that. You know, it's one of those. I want to mate with that because I'm one of those. Or it's used in some sort of territorial display. We don't know. Seems reasonable. And finally, honker. Did it make a noise? This is where a good friend of mine called Dave Weishampel at Johns Hopkins got interested. And he's working on these sorts of critters and had this horn or tube CT scanned and look at the complexity of those tubes inside. Very complex trombone-like arrangement. And he actually got some plumbing pipes and bits and pieces and put a mouthpiece on one end and blew down it. And lo and behold, it sounded like a foghorn. And they've also done a computer simulation of the same and come out with the same sound, a deep foghorn, which makes a terrible lot of sense. These animals are known occasionally in relatively large numbers in fossil bone beds. They may well have been herd-living animals, which as prey, because they were plant eaters, would have been subject to the attentions of Tyrannosaurus. They were rough contemporaries of T-Rex, for example. If you have a herd, and luckily one's keeping an eye out and spots a T-Rex on the horizon, if you made a high-frequency squeak, like the tweet of a bird in the present day, the T-Rex would say, it was you, straight onto you. If you produce a deep, low-frequency, long-wavelength sound, like the foghorn of a ship, you haven't got a clue where it's come from. You just know it's there. Or the whole herd can hear that, so can the T-Rex. Whole herd's alerted, you haven't been identified, you get safely away. Makes an awful lot of sense in a biological sense. But what it might be telling us is that actually we've got quite sophisticated communities of organisms that communicate. This is not the slow, sluggish, destined for extinction sort of model. It's something different. I can take it a tiny bit further, because I want to, by looking at the other critter. So we've looked at that fella, and it could have had a multifunctional crest. Acute sense of smell, visual recognition, honking. Perfectly reasonable. You know, one structure doesn't have to have one function. It could have a diversity of functions. Nature's like that. So what about this one? Well, we have modern techniques now for looking at these things. The CT scan that you saw just now is now refined. So we have aero engineers who will happily loan their CT equipment to CT scan very large specimens like dinosaur skulls, because it's fun. It's not like an aero engine. And this is a surface scan of a beautifully preserved Corythosaur skull. You can see the crest at the top there. This is a CT scan, but segmented. So you've got the transparent bones here, but it's segmented so all the cavities within, which we would love to know about, are now revealed. Normally what you'd have to do is accidentally drop the specimen so you can see inside. Don't tell the curator, but that's, as a paleontologist, you want to know, you want to research, but you've got these people who want to keep these things in aspic and you can't break them, you can't... So CT scanning gets you around that. So this is the passageway of the nasal tube. So the air passes in from the nostril here, down a convoluted sort of air passage to the back of the throat and then down to the lungs. That passage passes the front part of this mauve bit here. which I want you to register as a shape. This is the cavity where the brain was. We'd call it euphemistically the brain of the animal. Front part of the brain, just like yours here, is where the olfactory lobes are, and that feeds your sense of smell. So the sense of smell is sort of reinforced by this complex arrangement here and the juxtaposition. But we've also got this information, oh, there's the brain. And these are blood vessels in red and cranial nerves in yellow, and that's the pituitary that hangs down from the bottom of the brain. Wow, quite a lot of complicated soft biology sort of implied in the cavities within the skull itself. Not exciting. Well, sort of exciting. So what does it tell you? Well, there's a question there. Is it really the brain? And I'm going to say no, it ain't. It's the cavity where the brain sat. Again, human perceptions is that our brain case is full of brain. Reptiles aren't like that. They have a large brain case, and the brain fits inside, but there's all sorts of other sinuses and things above. So there isn't a direct correlation between the brain cavity and the actual brain. So in a sense, that makes them look quite smart, because the brain looks quite big. But in fact, the brain was smaller than that. So you can make mistakes. Maybe some people could think that was a more intelligent dinosaur than it really was. So let's look a bit further. And this brings in some of the research I did years ago. The study of the brains of dinosaurs has an unbelievably long history. It goes back to 1871. John Whittaker Hulk of this society did a lot of work on reptiles from the Mesozoic, Wealden of the Isle of Wight and elsewhere, and described them, amongst which was a block of bone that turned out to be part of the skull of an Iguanodon. It wasn't appreciated until 1882, and that takes us back to that introduction from Malcolm, where dinosaurs at Bernissar in Belgium, a herd of them were discovered and were described in 1882. And that's when the penny dropped and thought, that bone actually is the shape of the brain case of Iguanodon. And so it seems. There's Iguanodon. It unfortunately is rather sad. It doesn't have all these fabulous sort of structures on the roof of its skull. It's rather boring, but it's the ultimate ancestor of things like the rather elaborate duck-billed dinosaurs. So it's ancestral. It's sort of got a more basic sort of configuration. But as you can see, it's the same sort of configuration of animal as plant eater with a sort of beak, a little bit duck-like, not quite as exaggerated. But that's just to confirm. There's one of my boring technical drawings of this beast. There's the duck-like beak, large eye, and tucked in here, the brain case. There is Hulk's specimen. It's in the Natural History Museum. I studied it as part of my thesis. So you do technical drawings. Those are all the bones as preserved. And you can see there are lots of grooves and holes. These are actually muscle scars, ligament scars, and cranial nerves popping out through the fabric of the brain case. There's a sort of technical drawing of the anatomy, identifying some of the cranial nerves, and the Vidian canal there, which is the artery going in to feed the floor of the brain case. And you're getting topography and geography sorted out. There's the brain case. There's the shape of the brain cavity. There's the pituitary at the bottom, hanging down like a grape. You've got this one hump there, and then a major hump in the middle, and it tapers off to the spinal cord. That's that's the shape I want you just to remember briefly, because we'll see it again. So I was lucky because whilst I was working on some more material, there was a very unpromising block of rock collected from Sussex, from a brick pit. And somebody had thrown it under a bench in the Natural History Museum, and nobody knew what it was. It was part of the skull of Iguanodon. I was able to identify it and got the museum to sort of reluctantly cut it just off the midline and scrape away all the bone. So all the bone was destroyed, because I could see that actually the cavity where the brain lay and other structures was filled with sediment, and the sediment was very hard and faithfully reproduced the internal structures. And there it is. This is the cut area. So I sort of just skimmed the brain as it happened. It was just a guess. There's that structure, the one hump, second hump, going back to the spinal cord here. These are all 12 cranial nerves preserved. There's part of the internal carotid artery going into the pituitary fossa here and perfusing the blood within the brain case, and this is part of the venous drainage system, the used blood passing back to the neck. Technical stuff that you don't need to know. There's another view of the same thing from the other side, and just a sort of gee whiz thing. These are fine blood vessels here running through the wall of the brain case, part of the venous drainage system. That is part of the inner ear. Those are the semicircular canals that allow me to stand here and not fall over. It's part of the balancing system that operates within our brain cases just as much as it did in these dinosaurs. Well developed, and yeah, of course they have a sense of balance. Perfectly expected. So, you go on, and this is that shape within the brain case, sort of transparent-ified, and these are my guess of the lobes of the brain, not filling the cavity, but that's what I think is the cerebral hemispheres, optic lobes, and cerebellum. And then all the cranial nerves, and then just to be fancy-dancy, this is the arterial supply to the floor of the brain case, and this is the venous drainage. Wow. The embarrassing thing is that we know more about the anatomy of the brain case and venous drainage than we do in some living reptiles today. So people on the other side of the archway here, take note. And then things change yet again. And this is where Martin Brazier came in. A specimen was found on the beach at Bexhill. A very unpromising pebble, about yay big. And this is it. You now recognize the shape, hopefully, in profile. You've got a lump here, a bigger lump here, and it's tapering off into the spinal cord. This is part of the brain, part of the floor of the brain case and bits of broken bone, but that's not relevant. Martin was very interested in biomineralization, preservation of tissues as mineral replicas. And that's why we started to argue. I'll explain briefly what that meant later. What he'd seen was some funny structure up here that intrigued him and made me think, I wonder if there's soft tissue preserved on the surface, and whether that tells me something about the brain. Ultimately, Martin thought that was a complete, solid, mineralized brain. That's where I disagreed with him, because I think it's just mineralized up here. But we'll go into that just briefly. So, we argued for 2 or 3 years about this. Then he got killed in a road accident, and we published it in his memory just last year. So this is the specimen. There is Hulk's original brain case from 1871, cut in half. It fits perfectly. I'm not saying that they go together. They clearly don't. Bexhill, Isle of Wight, they do not fit, but they are the same size. And the shape correspondence is lovely. So, another sedimentary cast of the internal space, and it's sort of telling us something as a natural endocast about the cavity where the brain sat. And it might be telling us maybe a little bit more. This is a rather bad photograph of the surface that we were interested in on the top of the skull. You'll see better photographs in a minute. But basically, imagine your bed after you've slept on it, and you look at the sheet in the morning, it's all rumpled and crinkled. That's basically what you're seeing, a crinkled sheet. These are slightly better, and I hope you can see the wrinkling on the surface there. You can see more of the wrinkling over here on these scanning electron micrographs. And this is a close-up of more of that wrinkled sheet with a tube running obliquely through the fabric. It's a blood vessel running through this crinkled sheet. And this crinkled sheet has the appearance and form of what we know as, or we call, meninges. Meninges are tough fibrous layers that surround your brain. The main cortex of the brain is soft and sloppy. But around it, there are these tough ligamentous sheets that form a series of layers that suspend the brain and protect it. So underneath the brain case, there's these tough membranes, and then there's the soft, squidgy brain. And what we seem to be seeing is a mineralized remnant of that crinkly sheet that's supporting the brain. Amazing. It gets better. Scanning EM showed far more detail, which I won't bore you with, but I will show you these diagrams, at least because you can see things a bit more clearly. There are tubes running through the fabric just underneath the peeled, wrinkled bits of sheeting. So because the specimen's eroded, there are bits where you can see just underneath the wrinkled sheeting, and underneath there you can see these incredible tubes, some of which are branching, and look at their dimensions. They're somewhere between 25 and 50 microns in diameter, just enough room for a blood cell to get through. These are capillaries. These are capillaries within the fabric of the brain, the cortex, the squidgy stuff underneath these meninges. And this is the vascular supply to that. And rather interestingly, there's a broken tube there, these are preserved in siderite, iron carbonate, and you can see this sort of amorphous stuff here. This is microcrystalline colophane, calcium phosphate primarily, crystals of calcium phosphate, which I think are mimicking the fabric of the cortex of the brain, that sort of the soft grey matter of the brain. They're not replicating the cells, of course, that'd be stupid, but they are, in a sense, giving you an essence of the distinction between the fabric of the brain and the capillary network within the fabric. Astonishing. I mean, if you'd asked me just a few years ago, would we ever find soft tissues of a brain? Absolutely not. I mean, it's so squidgy, it decays so quickly, not a hope of finding anything remotely like that. I'm completely contradicted by this amazing discovery. We needed to sort of verify what the stuff is. So these are just spectrographs, EDS spectrographs of the little brown crystals, the siderite crystals that we found on the fabric surface, and the colophane. And all the EDS is telling you really is that the background is basically silt, mostly silicon, but the crystals of iron carbonate are genuinely crystals that are enriched in iron carbonate, and the background, colophane, is genuinely calcium and phosphate, as we hoped and as we thought. So it's nice to just get that technical backup to support the way we were interpreting that, because that was actually quite important in terms of building a scenario. And this is where, you know, you're scratching your head and think, well, how on earth could this have been preserved? So this was the overall scenario that I built, trying to think about the chemistry of what was going on, let alone the biology of what we're seeing. And again, it's forensic. I'm bringing chemistry in order to try and interpret what I'm seeing here. And what you've got, basically, is a scenario, and it's no more than that. I hate the word, but, I mean, this is the best we can do. We're trying to explain how on earth things could have been preserved the way they have. There's the critter. It must have died. There's its brain. We suspect that when it died, it collapsed, and its head, or maybe the rest of its body, fell into a stagnant swamp. The stagnant swamp is important. It's an acidic, preservative environment. As it sank into the swamp, because it's lying on its back, the brain case up here, actually when you turn it over, becomes a bowl. So the brain slops into the bowl in this acidic environment. In that acidic environment, the tissues surrounding the brain are gradually dissolved by the acidic environment. You've got a phosphoric acid sequence in these swamp waters. That means you mobilize the brain case minerals, the apatite, you dissolve them and create a rich soup of phosphate. You also have, where does the iron come from? Oh dear. Our bodies are full of iron. Muscle and blood is full of iron. We have a natural resource of iron. You can build the iron carbonate from the iron that the body provides as it decays. You've got a source of iron, a source of phosphate, a source of carbonate in the water. And what we suspect is that the brain overturned, collapsed into the brain cavity, and was pickled. The acidic environment pickles these tissues. It hardens them enough to form a template against which the minerals could then precipitate. So you end up with a localized area here of iron carbonate-rich deposit and colophane, calcium phosphate, sort of filling and crystallizing in the area in that very acid anoxic environment. Anoxic because you've got all this decay, all the oxygen is consumed as a part of the product of decay, and you end up with this localized area of heavy mineralization for a short period of time. The rest of the brain case rots away, sediment is then swept in, and these are bits of leaf and old bits of bone and sediment piled in on top, as we find in the actual fossil. And the argument I had with Martin, bless his cotton socks, was we took some rough CT scans and found all these fragments of plant and bone and bits and pieces in this area here. And Martin thought, these are the internal structures of the brain itself. And that's the source of our deep argument about how you interpret this. But actually, when we got better resolution CT scans, sadly after Martin had passed away, they were plant and bits of bone and all sorts of other debris that had washed in on top of the mineralized portion. So, sorry, Martin, I was right, you were wrong. So this is a sort of slightly fanciful view of if you were to dissect an iguanodon skull, peel back the skin, then there's the bone surface of the brain case roof. Underneath you have a complexity of meninges, mineralized, tough collagenous sheets that surround the cortex of the brain. And there are other sort of fabric structures that we think we can discern, these choroid villi and so on, and blood vessels running through this fabric as well, from and within the cortex. And just underneath, I think we've just got a trace of the high vascularity of the cortex itself, preserved in iron carbonate, with this sort of mush of calcium phosphate, which echoed where the cortex, or the cellular debris of the cortex, was to be found. So, how smart was Dinosaur, like Iguanodon? I've sort of generally done a sort of simplified, what's called a cephalization quotient estimation, based on the guessing how much of that space was occupied by the brain. This caused controversy because when people discovered that the brain was touching the top of the brain case, it's proof that surely the whole brain cavity was filled with brain. Therefore, they're smart, because it's had a large volume of brain. But I think our scenario where the brain flops into the roof of the skull means that actually that's a mistake, fundamentally a mistake. So the rationalization is here. That's a crocodile. That's standard crocodile intelligence. Don't underestimate a crocodile. They are very smart creatures. They learn. They have very complex behaviours. They look after their young. They really are very complicated and complex beasts when they're in the right environment. So crocodiles are there in terms of brain volume, relation to body volume. Some dinosaurs have a lesser brain size relative to brain volume relative to body size. Not surprising. These are some of the biggest dinosaurs. Other dinosaurs, like the non-avian theropods and the bird ancestors of theropods, have a larger brain in relation to their body volume. So Iguanodon, yeah, it's reasonably smart in dinosaur terms. Not brilliant, not dumb. Somewhere in the middle, perhaps as you might expect. It's sort of meaningless, actually, because it doesn't tell you anything about behaviour, doesn't tell you about relative intelligence. It's just a notion of how we might think that the size of the brain might affect or have some bearing on the intelligence of the animals, which is a silly assumption, really. So, smarter than the crocodile? Maybe. Like I say, don't underestimate crocodile. But not nearly as smart as the birdline dinosaurs, judged by brain volume. So where have we got to? Can we ever know how dinosaurs thought in any genuinely objective way? Well, we can deduce a number of aspects from the functional biology behaviour and interpret behaviour of dinosaurs through various lines of that forensic sort of bringing as much information in and building a sort of general scenario. We can even sort of begin to interpret aspects of their physiology, their metabolism and so on. The exceptional preservation conditions allow us to actually investigate part of the brain structure. Fabulous. But we're no closer to knowing what they thought or how they thought. So I'm sorry to have brought you here under false pretenses. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, David. Questions, please? One right up the back there. You just wait for the microphone. Thanks.
You've shown us a wide range of dinosaurs and allied genre, and given that the dinosaurs diversified quite considerably throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous, especially around the period of glacials, and indeed mammals diversified considerably from the Eocene onwards, especially primates around the time of the Quaternary glacials. What do you think the chances might have been if an asteroid hadn't wiped them out 66 million years ago, that some of them might have gone on to develop intelligence not too far apart from the level of our own?
This echoes some work by a media-conscious colleague of mine called Dale Russell from many years ago, who built the Dinosauroid. In truth, we have them, they're birds. So we can study dinosaur behaviour by studying birds. They are dilineal descendants of one branch of dinosaurs. So we can be confident about various aspects of their behaviour when we look at avian theropods and true birds. The prospect of classic dinosaurs surviving requires conditions that are not conducive to our life on Earth. Basically, throughout the Mesozoic, they lived in greenhouse world. If you can grow tropical plants in the Arctic Circle, then there is no issue in relation to temperature control. What you've got for the majority of dinosaurs is an incredibly warm, pleasant world. In fact, too hot for mammals. Mammals were basically crepuscular throughout the reign of dinosaurs. That means they came out at night, they lived in burrows, and when it was cool enough, they could make life, because they trade off being able to generate body heat by losing it to the environment and regulating and measuring the way in which they lose heat to the environment. It's like a dripping tap scenario. The dinosaurs, if they started to encounter climatic deterioration and latitudinal zonation, they would have contracted, first of all, in terms of their range, and then been outcompeted by animals like the descendant dinosaurs, the birds, that can control their physiology, and the mammals. So, yes, they would have survived for a while if they hadn't gone extinct, but we'd still be here now. dinosaurs could not stand weird world. We live in weird world. I mean, having two ice-covered poles in the history of life on Earth is totally weird. I mean, if you go back from the late tertiary, when was the last time we had certifiable glacial cover? The Carboniferous. And that was one ice pole on the southern landmasses. After the Carboniferous, nothing, basically nothing. So the world we live in is utterly weird, which is hard for us to grasp because it's all we know. But the world of the Mesozoic was completely different from the world that we're familiar with today.
So you don't think there would have been further radiation of the dinosaurs?
Yes, in the form of birds. There would have been, while the general climatic conditions would sustain some dinosaurs, they would have continued to diversify on the isolated continents post-Cretaceous. But that would have been limited. So apart from birds, we wouldn't be sharing them today.
Okay, very good. Question over there.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. A couple of questions, if I may. When you talk about the comparison between elephants and bipedal dinosaurs, is that a fair comparison considering the locomotion is different, therefore the pressure pattern is going to be different?
It's not a fair comparison. It's an attempt to say that dinosaurs are very diverse in locomotor habits and style. And that has implications on what you think about their physiology. I mean, I could give you another lecture, but basically, if you've got a bird-like anatomy like that fast-running dinosaur, that has implications about its metabolism. If you're super large, like an elephant is a non-typical mammal. They are heat embarrassed. They live in warm parts of the world. They can cope in this climate, but it's not typical of their distribution. And they shut down their metabolism. They don't have the high metabolic rate that we have. It's like comparing a mouse and an elephant. Metabolic rate of a mouse is enormous, or a shrew is enormous. Elephant, they shut everything down. They have very large volume, very small surface area, and that's why they're not hairy. They're actually trying to lose heat through the body wall. And why have they got flappy ears? Because they use the ears to dump heat to the environment. They are heat embarrassed. If you race an elephant, they overheat. So they have a problem of heat embarrassment. Now, if you scale that up fivefold to a decent-sized sauropod dinosaur, they are heat embarrassed. And the heat embarrassment is a real problem. And that goes back to the reason why dinosaurs have these air sac systems running through their bodies. It's a way of heat dumping. Their breath was like an exhaust pipe.
Okay, thank you. The bone structure, that cross-section of bone you showed, and you say it's an open structure with sort of vascular channels to provide circulation, but there's no marrow potential in that, surely, to produce blood.
The marrow is what happens when a bone starts off that diameter and ends up that diameter.
Right.
So you've got the fast deposited bone on the outside, you've got the remodeled bone in the middle, and then the bone in the middle is destroyed to create a trabecular structure, which is the marrow. So it depends on the dimension of the bone, how much reorganization's gone on.
So it'd be the large bones, basically, which produce it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
And
you.
it's even more complicated than that.
Young man down here.
If the Permian mass extinction didn't happen, then would have dinosaurs exist?
Yes, they do.
Oh.
Birds.
Because of the Permian mass extinction, all the Permian animals, Gorgonopsid, all those Permian animals, they killed off and made way for the dinosaurs to evolve. But if that didn't happen, then would have the Permian animals just carried on and become?
They did. Well, they did carry on. There are a range of Triassic mammal-like, so-called mammal-like reptiles, which are very diverse. And when you look at their anatomy, They are becoming more and more, progressively more and more mammal-like as you pass through the Triassic, until right at the beginning of the Jurassic, the first true mammals appear. And how big are they?
Quite small.
That big.
Small.
They're the size of a shrew, tiny little teeth. What appears to have happened is that there are different solutions to life, and different lineages operate in different ways. The mammal solution is the heat dumping scenario, where you live in a cold environment and lose heat to the environment and have a high metabolic rate. If you can fuel that by being active and feeding sufficiently, then that'll work, but you need a cool environment. The things that are best adapted for the environment that dominated the Mesozoic are dinosaurs. And I mean, I could give you a lecture on the way in which they remove from their body nitrogenous waste. The big point that I'll make is that right at the beginning of the reign of dinosaurs, it was really hot and dry. The supercontinent of Pangaea was essentially red bed environment. And under those conditions, it's hot, it's dry. Where's the water? Where's the food? It's like living in a desert. Under those conditions, is it good to be a mammal? No, it's tricky. All the mammals are small, live in burrows. The only ones that are big are camels, but they cheat. They're not really mammals. They do all sorts of weird things with their physiology to cope with being big and living in a desert with no food and no water. If to make you laugh, the big thing about us is we need to go to the toilet. We need to piss. We need to piss because we produce urea from our kidneys. It's water soluble. Have you ever seen a bird cock its leg against a tree and piss?
To be honest, no.
I would hope not. What do they produce that you know of? Bird droppings. That is their piss. They produce urates. They're very clever biochemically, and all the dinosaur lineage are better than we are. They produce urates which are insoluble. So bird droppings are the equivalent of urine, but all the water's sucked out. It precipitates the urates, and the poo and the urate paste is what falls on your head. If you live in a desert and you can conserve all your water and you don't sweat, brilliant. And that's where dinosaurs scored. They don't need much food to start with, and they have this amazing conservation system for water, and they don't sweat because they have scaly skins. Does that answer you, sort of?
Very good. I think we'll have one last question over there. We must be going to glass of wine time sometime soon. Let this man off.
I was wondering whether, looking at the behaviour of the current large monitor-type lizards, gives us any ideas in relation to the behaviour of the dinosaurs.
A Komodo dragon is actually an interesting animal anatomically. It's too large to be a lizard, and therefore it's inventing mechanisms in its skeleton which are non-lizard-like. Lizards have an amazingly flexible locomotor system. A Komodo dragon locks that up because it's trying to have its legs underneath its body and sort of waddles with its legs almost like a crocodile. And it's actually mimicking a crocodile in many ways. So they're actually a wonderful example of something that was a lizard, it's built on a lizard bow plan, but it's compromising that because it's trying to be as big as a crocodile. And they're instructive because it's like producing a series of analogues for the functional constraints that are associated with large size, which were solved by dinosaurs, not solved by lizards properly, and only half solved by crocodiles.
Very good. I think with that, we're going to go to them.